I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I went a little bit off topic to talk to Neil Sinden, who's the director of the London branch of the CPRE, which is the Campaign for Rural England. I'd seen mention of the urban right to roam, a topic that was debated at the CPRE London AGM back in May, and it piqued my interest and it made me wonder about how much freedom we do have to roam across our cities and indeed our countryside. I'd always assumed that we have inalienable rights across public land, but it seems it's not as clear cut as I thought. As Neil mentions in the interview, 2.6 million people in the UK live more than a 10-minute walk from a green space. And that's hugely important as our country becomes more urbanised, and it's important if, for you, your local green space is your only garden. I started off by asking Neil why it's necessary to have a branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England in a city like London.
Well, yeah, it might seem counterintuitive that there is a branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England in London, but we exist because there is lots of countryside in London, actually. London is a relatively green city by global standards. We have lots of green belts within the city boundary. Almost a quarter of London is classified as designated green belt. And closer to inner London, there is quite a large area of land which is designated as metropolitan open land, which is equivalent to the green belt. But actually very important for people living in perhaps the more denser parts of inner London. So we have a lot of green space, a lot of countryside, and indeed the countryside should be a benefit for everyone, particularly perhaps people who spend most of their lives working and living in dense, large cities such as London. So it's critical that there is a branch of the CPRE here. And we believe very strongly that the landscape of London, both built and natural, is an important part of the quality of life for people living and working here.
What is the remit of your branch of the CPRE?
Well, we're a charity, and our objects are set out in line with charity law. You know, we're a public interest organisation. We're concerned really with the way in which land is used and developed within the Greater London boundary. So the boundary of our operation coincides with the boundary of the Greater London Authority. And I suppose we have two core parts to our remit. One is to promote better use of existing developed land within London. So how can we make better use of what you might call brownfield land, or land which has been built on but which is not actually in any kind of productive or efficient use. And secondly, how can we protect and improve and extend green space or undeveloped land, or if you like, London's countryside, so that it can provide more benefits to Londoners and people visiting London than it currently does. Whilst our remit is restricted to operating within Greater London, of course we work in collaboration with other parts of the CPRE network. And there are branches outside of London in the wider southeast covering the home counties, and we try to work in collaboration with them to ensure that the countryside beyond London's boundary is, you know, protected and safeguarded for all to use, not just people that live within those areas.
And one of the things I was wondering was, how does the right to roam work in an urban space?
There is no, strictly speaking, there is no legal right to roam in urban areas. But we use this as a term to, if you like, draw attention to the importance of people's ability to move on foot and by bike around London in a way which, if you like, enables them to enjoy the green environment, enjoy access to fresh air, enjoy access to relatively quiet parts of, if you like, public space and open space in the public realm. And we use the term right to roam because, of course, in 2000, the government of the day introduced through the Countryside and Rights of Way Act a right to roam in rural areas, covering down moorland, heathland, and coastal areas. And we think that opening up of public access to those kinds of landscapes is an important contributor to people being able to enjoy those areas. But it's also something that perhaps we need to be thinking about and debating within the context of our urban landscape. So we have simulated a discussion around the idea of an urban right to roam as a way of really talking about why public access to green space and open space is important in London, why it's important for bringing health benefits for our well-being, and and really to sort of explore how we can secure better public access and increase public access to open space and green space within the city. Data published recently has revealed that nationally something like 2.6 million people do not live within a 10-minute walk of green space, and there are still, even within London, which is, as I say, a relatively green city, there are still large areas of deficiency in access to green space, and we want to do what we can to improve public access so that all Londoners and all communities living in Greater London have the ability to access green space on their doorstep.
Did that debate arise because access to our public footpaths and rights of way are being diminished? Are they under threat in any way, nationally and in cities?
Well, there is a concern that alongside the introduction of a rural right to roam in 2000, legislation is in place, which means that unless paths that are used as a public right of way are properly registered and recorded in what is called a definitive map before the year 2026, so it's not so long away, then we risk losing those rights of way if even if they have been used for decades by people moving around their local area, their local neighbourhood. And so there is a risk that we will lose some important rights of way in urban areas unless they are properly recorded through that legal process. And the other reason we're concerned is that the situation in London in terms of recording definitive rights of way, public footpaths and so on, is actually pretty complex and confused. There are some London boroughs, particularly in outer London, places like Bromley and Enfield, for example, where the local authorities do have reasonably up-to-date definitive maps of rights of way in their areas. But other parts of London and other London boroughs don't have such definitive maps. And there is a fair bit of confusion, really, about what the legal responsibilities are for London boroughs to keep an accurate record of rights of way. And we also sort of want to draw attention to this important issue as well, certainly as we run up to 2026, to ensure that all legal rights of way in London, whether they're more than 50 or 60 years old or more recent, are properly recorded and protected so that future generations can actually enjoy the legal rights of access that they entail. So we're concerned about that, but we're also concerned to ensure that where there isn't existing public access to land, and particularly to green space, that we can look at ways in which greater access can be provided, and that may be through ensuring that green spaces are open to the public at certain times of the year, or are open to the public to access at certain times during a day where they may not otherwise be publicly accessible, and by promoting new green routes through central London so that people living in central London can walk from their doorstep to the countryside, if you like, or the green belt on the outskirts of London, without losing touch with green space and what some people call green infrastructure. So there's a really important agenda, I think, in terms of promoting rights of way and public access within towns and cities like London, and ensuring that we're making walking an attractive and accessible and healthy means of getting around the city.
I mean, I assumed, and I admittedly I don't know very much about this issue, but I assumed everything was documented on Ordnance Survey maps. Our footpaths were set in stone and protected. But it seems from looking at your website that actually there is more land that's becoming privately owned public space. And I can only assume that, again, that's where some of the complications arise. But I'm thinking maybe, is there a cost benefit to local authorities, say, if they allow a private company to take over the management of what was is still a public space but was previously managed by the local authority? Is it a cost issue, or how are these things getting swallowed up or missed off?
Well, has been in recent years this increasingly common phenomenon, which is some people describe as privately owned public space, where, as you say, developers acquire land sometimes in quite central London locations, and will develop a proportion of it by putting buildings on it, and then perhaps create a green space or paved area around buildings, which to all intents and purposes look as if they're publicly accessible areas of land. People can walk over them, can walk along the river, for example. So the area, which is called Moor London, next to City Hall on the banks of the River Thames between London Bridge and Tower Bridge, is what some describe as a privately owned public space. You can access that space, but actually you don't have a legal right to be there, and there are certain restrictions imposed on what you can do when you're on that land. And we've heard reports of people being prevented from taking photographs from those areas. There's certainly concern about people gathering in groups and protesting in places like that. And this is becoming it seems to be becoming an increasingly common way in which land is redeveloped within central London. Granary Square, which is a very new piece of regeneration near King's Cross, just north of King's Cross, along the Grand Union Canal. That area is also what you would call a privately owned public space. Canary Wharf, another example of this kind of thing happening, and we are concerned that there isn't general sort of public awareness of the extent of these kinds of areas, and indeed public awareness about the fact that rights of access to these areas can relatively easily be removed or stripped, and people can be prevented from doing what they expect to be able to do in these areas. And we wanted to draw attention to that as well with our debate around the idea of an urban right to roam, and to see what can be done to ensure that the private owners of such spaces actually do allow people to freely access and congregate in these areas, provided they're behaving and acting responsibly. So we're very pleased that the Greater London Authority at the moment is looking at how these areas, these kinds of areas, can be better managed, and how people can be allowed and encouraged to use these areas responsibly, in order to exercise their, if you like, human rights to move around the city and enjoy these open spaces as they wish.
Yeah, I guess you could conceivably get marooned on an island if you keep losing access across spaces. I guess there's nothing in place to say actually what that land needs to contain, not just for humans but for other species. I guess it's just, free for whoever the owner is to treat it as they like. So if they want to pave the entire area, they can do, which again diminishes the amount of green corridors that we have, and as you say, the network that connects to the wider landscape beyond London. So the whole thing is actually quite terrifying.
Yeah, we are concerned about the lack of mechanisms, legal mechanisms, policy mechanisms to ensure that we can, protect and enhance and grow the network of publicly accessible green and open spaces in London. Of course, we have the planning system, the land use planning system, which can prevent, when it's used correctly, overdevelopment of areas and inappropriate development of areas. But we don't think that the planning system is always able to ensure that we get the right outcomes from that kind of process. And there is far too much. I would argue that there's far too much public open space which is paved over, which doesn't have adequate, natural features, whether it's mature, well managed, well maintained trees or grassed areas or wildlife habitats. And we need to do a lot more to ensure that we have a more sensitive approach to how we can, reintroduce, if you like, the natural environment and reveal more of London's natural landscape in some of the public areas that we're developing and looking after at the moment. And I think that's going to become an increasingly important issue in the context of climate change. The urban heat island effect, I think, requires us to be planting many more trees, to be inducing more plants and vegetation into urban environments in order to help urban areas adapt to a changing climate, and that's going to become an increasingly important challenge for us moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So thinking about the spaces where there are mature trees, grass, for example, such as some of our larger parks, I was wondering, when we close off places such as Clapham Common or Hyde Park for music events or festivals or whatever, who authorises that? And are those things becoming kind of more common? Because I guess that it is a problem for people who use those areas on a regular basis, and then all of a sudden find they can't get access to that. So who lets that happen?
Well, I mean, green spaces and large parks and smaller pockets of green space across London are sort of owned and managed in very different ways by different authorities. I mean, we have obviously within London the Royal Parks Agency, which looks after some of the largest areas of land, of which formerly would have belonged to the Crown and which are now kind of managed, for the public benefit and looked after for the public benefit in central London. But even these areas where you would expect, to be quite strict controls over commercial events and private use of these areas, we're seeing this being, becoming much more common. In places like Hyde Park, large parts of Hyde Park close to Marble Arch closed off for a large part of the summer months for such kind of commercial music events and things. In Victoria Park in East London, for example, another park which isn't a royal park, but which is, despite its name, is owned by the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, is used a lot during the early summer months for commercial events. As a result of local community pressure, I think that Victoria Park is not used as much as it has previously been used during the school summer holidays, because it's recognised that during the school holidays, the local community have more need to access, who aren't perhaps able to afford holidays in distant places, have more need to use these more local green spaces. So these pressures are becoming important. Finsbury Park is another case in point where I think another historic London park, which is which is heavily used for commercial activities during the summer months, and actually to the extent that a large areas of the green sort of landscape of Finsbury Park is damaged and takes weeks or months to recover. So it's not just the times when these areas are closed for commercial events, it's the period of time that it takes for these areas to recover from the heavy use of the land during those periods, which can cause problems and concerns for local communities. So we are bothered about this. I mean, clearly local authorities are under pressure from the public, from sort of cuts to the public purse and public finances, and are looking for alternative ways to raise an income. But when it comes to, if you like, privatising our green space, that then becomes a huge issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's another thing that you kind of assume is set in stone, and you have a right to access and enjoy these areas. But actually, it's not quite as cut and dried. So thinking about cities internationally, are there any that are really getting this right? Are there any cities that have got a really good track record when it comes to assuring that urban rights to roam and adequate provision of or preservation of green spaces happens?
I don't think there's any kind of one country or one city that's a sort of kind of a beacon or a paragon for other cities to follow. But there is in Scotland an urban a right to roam, which is slightly different to the right to roam that was introduced in England, which I think gives greater rights to access open space and green areas such as golf courses, that might be close to urban centres in Scotland. And I think that legal mechanism is certainly something that needs to be explored in terms of what benefits it might bring to a place like London. Some of the countries, the Nordic countries in Northern Europe, like Sweden and Norway, have a well-established right to roam in rural areas and a right to wild camp in undeveloped areas. It'd be interesting to see the extent to which those rights over undeveloped land apply to within towns and cities in Sweden and Norway. But I think it would be wrong to paint too gloomy a picture about London's ability to sort of protect and maintain and improve its own inheritance of green spaces. I think we're doing already quite a lot in London to draw attention to the benefits of access to green spaces. And I think the National Park City campaign, which the Mayor of London has been supportive of in recent months, is a good example of a grassroots campaign to promote the benefits of the protection of and the improvement of and use of green spaces in the city. And the GLA also, I understand, is working on what they call a public London charter, which is that the Mayor intends to issue in 2020 to set out the rights and responsibilities, if you like, of owners of public space within London and how set out some principles whereby these spaces can be better managed, better cared for, and better used by members of the public for sort of recreational purposes and so on. So that's an interesting initiative that we support. And I think there is also general recognition that we do need to look at ways in which we can better fund the management and care of our green spaces in London. And the GLA has established a London Green Spaces Commission, which is working at this moment on this question and which will hopefully issue a report with some sort of realistic and beneficial kind of proposals for how to fund our green spaces more effectively in future. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in London. I'm sure we can always learn from best practice overseas parts of the UK, such as Scotland, but we shouldn't be too despondent that we're not doing a certain amount of good work in this area.
Well, it seems as if all is not lost just yet. I finished the interview by asking Neil about how people can help if they're concerned, and our connection was a little bit patchy, so I'm going to summarise what he said, and I'll also put links to the various organisations in the show notes. Neil recommended you check out the London Friends of Green Spaces network website for details about getting involved in protecting and improving your local green areas. There's also a link to a map on their website which is hosted by Go Parks London, where you can register your local space. He mentioned that we can lobby our relevant boroughs and green space management companies, and CPRE London and the London Friends of Green Spaces are also putting pressure on London mayoral candidates to recognise the importance of our green spaces and our rights to have access to them. He also mentioned the historic rights of way and the fact that these need to be registered by 2026. I've put a link to a couple of useful websites in the show notes if you're concerned about a right of way in your area or if you'd like to find out more. And of course you can join CPRE London and find out lots more about their work by going to cprelondon.org.uk. So a very big thank you to Neil for taking part in the interview and for highlighting what is a really important issue in London but also in other urban environments in the UK and indeed across the world. In fact, if you're listening from outside the UK, I'd be really interested to hear about how public rights of way work in your country. You can always email me at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk or get in touch on social media. In fact, if you follow me on Facebook, where I'm at Roots and All UK, you'll see I've set up a discussion group and you'd be very welcome to join me there as currently I'm the only member. So thanks as always for listening. Don't forget, if you're enjoying the show, it would be really helpful if you could review the podcast in iTunes or wherever else you're listening, as it will help more listeners to find me. Catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.